Let's say you don't have the time, budget, or data to survey hundreds of people at random. Does that mean you can't do research at all? Not at all, actually. That's where non-probability sampling comes in. I'm Justin from Wall Strategy, and I help businesses turn research into clear strategy. In today's video, let's break down what non-probability sampling is, the main types, and when you should and should not use it. Now, from our previous video, I mentioned that probability sampling involves everyone having an equal or known chance of being selected. Now, the opposite is true in here. Not everyone in the population has an equal or known chance of being selected for non-probability sampling. It's often based on convenience, judgment, or even the people that you know in your network. With non-probability sampling, there's 4 types of them. First, there's convenience sampling, quota sampling, judgment or purposive sampling, and snowball sampling. Let's dive into each of them. With convenience sampling, this is where participants are chosen based on their availability and accessibility to the researcher rather than random selection. This method is quick, easy, and cost-effective, but it also has a lot of risk with bias, as typically you're just going to the most accessible person for your research. For example, if you go to a mall for convenience sampling, you might find a lot of good insights, but it may only apply for that zip code and may not apply somewhere else on a different map. Typically, this method is most useful for beginning studies. In this method, typically you might go to a shopping mall, you might ask your friends, family, coworkers, or people to take a survey, or sometimes you might have students just take a survey if you're a professor or a researcher yourself and going to colleges and asking for their opinions. Next is quota sampling, and this is where you're dividing the population into subgroups and then recruiting a specific number of participants from each subgroup to ensure that the final samples enough of the population and matches characteristics that you might want to measure, such as age, gender, diet, or other demographics within that population. And this ensures that there's inclusion of each key subgroups that can reflect on the entire population. Now, downside of this is, of course, potential bias as always, and this is mainly from the researcher judging what is key to reflect on the population. In order to perform quota sampling, you simply just divide the population into subgroups that you think is important with the characteristics, and then set a quota for each subgroup that is necessary. Usually this method is cost and time effective, and it also ensures that there's enough representation within each subgroup, but of course there's always a potential for bias, and of course populations that are hard to reach can be excluded. With judgmental sampling, this is essentially where the researcher assumes what is most valuable to answer their hypothesis or question. And this is something that I tend to do a lot, and of course this method does have bias as well. For example, I was working in a case study where I needed to measure people who eat certain types of snacks or frozen foods and certain types of products that you would go buy at Target or Walmart. But typically these people are really buying these snacks already or these products, whereas potentially we might want to target people who don't eat as much snacks and frozen food or chips, and we want to persuade them to buy more. And so understanding this nuance, we might be able to aim for super promoters, but we might not be able to get additional customers. And when it comes to consulting or even in business, internally, it's something important to make clear when discussing your findings. However, generally the reason why I do this is because I'm working in an industry or on a particular product, and it's really a good method to understand perceptions and beliefs about a particular subject or even a small subgroup within that population and what they think of that product or service or that specific industry itself. Now, the next one is snowball sampling, and this is where typically you would ask the participant if they know anyone else who fits the same criteria that you had created for that person. An example of this is someone with a rare disease where perhaps only 1,000 people have it in the United States. Typically, we can rely that another person would know that other person as well and have the same disease. That has a community, and they can reach out to them and tell them to participate in this study for better access for healthcare or more research purposes for curative treatments and things like that. And so while it helps find other participants who match your target market, it also has significant risk of having the same answers, a lot of repeated data that doesn't lead to additional conclusions, and it can also have sampling bias where participants are just non-representative of a larger group of population. Additionally, there's also ethical concerns where sensitive topics can be discussed, but of course, consent is always necessary when doing research. Now, typically you would use non-probability sampling in many areas. For example, if it's early stage exploration, as I had mentioned earlier, you just need quick insights to guide direction for where your project or even a simple business should go. Additionally, it's hard to reach group, as I have mentioned, when the population is small or specialized, such as doctors or rare diseases, or even people who are in specialized field. Another example of when to use non-probability sampling is qualitative research. With qualitative research, using non-probability is actually really helpful because it's at the convenience, quick accessibility, and also it can be cheaper, and qualitative research is typically more expensive to conduct. Now, in areas where you might not want to use it is when you're trying to find a much more statistical understanding of the entire population, or you're performing a national survey. You might not want to use this method when there is high stakes at the cost of your findings. For example, a pricing strategy for a large launch that requires a much more sophisticated approach like a conjoint analysis, but that's not a sampling method in the first place. Another example of when not to use it is when you want to calculate confidence intervals or statistical significance. Now, this is mainly on the research side and the statistical analysis kind of things, but generally with data analytics and quantitative methods, you want to go more for a probability sampling. And this is because the trade-off is that non-probability sampling is much more faster, cheaper, and easier to execute, and it's great for exploring depths without going deeper into the numbers. But at the cost of that is just generalizability, more risk of bias, and you can't always make statistical claims because mostly it's qualitative research that you would use this method in. And so to recap, non-probability sampling is a practical tool when you need speed, niche access, or even early insights, and typically great for qualitative methods. But just remember that a lot of it is great for direction, but not making a large claim for the entire population. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit subscribe for more market research insights you can actually use.